previous videos, we have talked a lot about how to prepare on good content for any group discussion. And you would remember that I've given you some sources to gather information on almost all sorts of topics. Now, even if you are very prepared and if you are one of those people who can pretty much find something to say about any topic, there's always a risk that if you hear something phrased a little differently or an expression that you haven't heard before, you might take a pause and get a little scared of how you're going to conduct yourself in that group discussion. So you must have heard that there is no dearth of topics, and the topics can be from pretty much anywhere, and the content has no limits, and the subjects are comprehensive and exhaustive. And these are of course true, but also that they're kind of tricks to have students take group discussions more seriously than they ought to. Bear in mind, I'm not saying that group discussions are not a serious stage. I'm simply saying that there is no reason for you to be scared of unknown, of the unfamiliar. Okay, there are ways of manipulating the topics, and there are ways of preparing on pretty much any topic as long as you give it a rational thought. So I'm going to give you a few examples, and these examples will range from the really familiar and the really common to the slightly more abstract to cover a great ground. Let me first talk about the two broad categories of topics that you can get in group discussions. The first one is, of course, the general. Now, within the general, there are multiple subcategories, and they can range from socio-political, in which you can talk about civil rights, you can talk about constitution and policy, you can talk about legislature, you can talk about socio-political issues of a more common nature, and so many other things. Laws, human rights policies, violation, property rights, and so on and so forth. Bear in mind that you are not supposed to know laws, you're only supposed to know about laws and policy. So as a practicing citizen of any country, you're just supposed to know what kind of rights you can and do exercise and have some opinions on it. That's all. You can also have topics talking about history. And of course, we're not talking about history which is really old. We're not going to talk about the world wars. We're not going to talk about any of the civil wars. It'll be more recent history of, let's say, the past decade. So once again, it comes down to how much you've been learning and what kind of reading habits you've had in the past decade. So your high school roughly and your college, your graduation. Topics can also be about economics, and of course we've talked previously about how economic policy and economic mergers and economic decisions are always supposed to be part of your subliminal knowledge. So always keep your eyes and ears open about what is going on in the world, especially the financial world. Since you're going for a business degree, it's only appropriate for you to understand and know something about it. You can also have issues now, especially about global warming and environmental conservation. A lot of people talk about the debate between nature versus nurture, and even though it's not a direct correlation, but you will also find a lot of topics to do with the combination of science and religion, or science and faith, and evolution and creation, these kind of debates. Now, even though these debates are a little more abstract in nature, you can find them to be a lot more physically created as well. So this is a little bit about the general topics, and a good policy to follow to prepare for general topics is to not really become engrossed in one subject, and instead kind of keep reading bits and pieces about lots of things, and just kind of ask yourself a lot of the times, how do I feel about that? What do I think about that? If I had to say something about it, what would I say? The misconception is that there is one whole category called the abstract topic. Okay, so before you prepare the abstract topic, prepare yourself to understand that there is no such thing as an abstract topic. Okay, the topics which are called abstract are generally made up of expressions, idioms and phrases, proverbs, similes, metaphors, things which are used to emphasize something, things which are used in language to create a certain effect. And when they are divorced from a context and when they're simply announced to you, they just seem so much more difficult, but they're actually not. So a good trick that I like to follow and I like to tell my students is, when you're looking at an abstract topic, look at the nouns and look at the verbs. Okay, I'm sure everybody understands nouns and verbs. So once you look at your nouns and verbs, just look at the correlation between the two and just make a comment about how they are interacting with each other. So later in this video, I will give you an example and I'll show you exactly how it's done. But let me quickly jump back to the general topics and tell you a little bit about what to do when the topic is known to you and how to create content right there and then, and what to do when the topic is slightly unfamiliar to you, but you still know that you can figure out something by learning and hearing. Let us take a couple of examples of general topics and see if we cannot figure out just the right content to say without having a lot of content and factual information on that topic. So the topic that I've chosen to discuss first of all is, some people are born to stay poor. It's some people are born to stay poor. If you listen to that topic at first, you will think that this is an abstract topic. And this is where a lot of people make the mistake of simply running on into an abstract tangent and just talking whatever they can about it. But if you carefully look at that topic, it's actually talking about the class structure. And we in India have a lot of information and a lot of background knowledge on class structure. So one of the mistakes that people might make when they're talking about this is fully agree or fully disagree with this topic. And if you just take a moment and reflect on the kind of insinuation the statement is making, you will understand very quickly that that's not a good way to go about it. In fact, let me go ahead and even say that most of the topics in these group discussions, especially now when the environment is not of yes or no, it's not of black or white, it's always a kind of a gray area. A good policy to stick by is to never have a yes or a no stance on any of the topics. And in fact, examine the topic a little further, probe a little bit, and ask each other questions in the group discussion and see if you cannot come up with an understanding, a definition, a kind of a caveat where all of us can have something to say about it, which doesn't have to be a definitely good or a definitely bad thing. So coming back to the topic of some people are born to stay poor, instead of simply talking in very open terms that yes, people are these and people are that, and some people work really hard and some people do not work very hard, what you can do is avoid categorizing people, because we can never talk about people as a general one group, can we? That's problematic. So instead, think back to all the times that you've heard your parents talk about income and income inequality and how taxation is a problem and how VAT keeps increasing year after year and what kind of rebates they get on their on what kind of savings and so on and so forth. And then think about the kind of people you get to help you and the kind of maids and housekeeping that we can hire these days. And even look at your city, look at around you, whoever lives in a cosmopolitan city or a metropolitan city or even in a smaller town, and look at the levels at which people financially exist. And you will very quickly see that there is a lot that goes without notice, because you don't think in terms of rich and poor. Here you think in terms of lower classes, upper classes and middle classes and so on. So just by making that very small observation, what you've done is you've given yourself a really good platform from which now you can begin making an argument, and you won't have to sound so general or so generic as to say that people do this, people do that, and instead you will have an actual acute observation to make in terms of what poor is in terms of your own context. Now, we just saw how to deal with a topic which is a little bit generally informed, but it also has some shades which can let you think about society in general. Keeping that aside, let's also move to a topic which sometimes makes you think that you know a lot about it. Okay, and that's a good thing. Keep that confidence. But when you start talking about it, you learn that what you really know is just perception and kind of judgments and opinions that don't really have a lot of basis. And here I would like to go back to a point which I may have mentioned before, that no matter how well spoken you are and how erudite you are, you will always need some sort of a factual definition, factual foundation to back up everything that you're saying. Okay, you can be a very fancy speaker, but if you don't have information to reason your argument, then that speak is just going to be a bit of a bluff. So coming back here, I'll take an example of a topic which goes, should wealthy nations share their wealth? Okay, I'll repeat, should wealthy nations share their wealth? Now, all of you, I can literally see that all of you have zoned out and you're thinking, oh yeah, I got this. I know this topic. Of course, yes, of course, definitely true. Of course, the US should share their wealth. I'm sure half of you are thinking the US and half of you are going to get there after going through China. That's okay as well. But let's come back to thinking about it in terms of presenting an argument, a sustainable argument in a group discussion. Now, this is where in one of the earlier segments I've mentioned using what other people are saying instead of putting all the pressure on yourself and figuring out all the information by yourself. This is exactly the kind of topic where you can definitely do that. Okay, say that the topic has been announced and somebody has taken the leap and said, today we're going to talk about this, and I've already told you not to do that, and you're just sitting and thinking to yourself, yeah, I know I agree, but I don't know why. Or I know that wealthy nations definitely have the responsibility of doing more for the world, but I'm not sure how to say it really well. I'm not sure how to make an argument out of it. That's a very fair question to put to yourself. But suddenly coming up with a sustainable argument and suddenly coming up with good statistical information is next to impossible. Okay, yes, we've been reading a lot. We've had BuzzFeed and we've had Al Jazeera English and we've had HuffPost and we've had all these articles inform us about various things, and we definitely know that there are certain nations which are a lot more developed than the others and certain others which are doing financially a lot better after the Great Depression than some other countries, and this is all general information. But when it comes to wealthy nations and the topic itself terminologizes it as wealthy nations, how is it that you categorize wealthy nations and how is it that you categorize certain other countries as the non-wealthy nations? Okay, any country that you put in the second category will become a little, I wouldn't say offended, because of course these countries are not in attendance, but it will sound a little in bad taste. So here's what you do. There will be people who will be walking, talking libraries, and there are always such. Use their information. They're going to give you some data, some information. The US has done this, Europe has done this, Germany has done this for Greece, or Ireland is looking to these countries for support. You will have these small little pieces of information flowing in from all corners. So instead of becoming nervous and tense and thinking, oh my God, or I don't know, I agree, but I don't know what to say and how to say it, listen to the other people. Form an opinion, and then have one or two sentences which will be without question correct, and then just say that. Because a lot of the times you will also be marked on how well you presented your argument and not just how well you were prepared with it. Okay, because all the moderators and all the B schools understand that it's virtually impossible for you to have something to say about everything. You're not expected to do that, but you are expected to be intelligent enough and cogent enough that you can listen to what is happening around you and participate in a group discussion. And that's what you should do. Now, in the next segment, we're going to talk about abstract topics. And like I told you before, it's a bit of a misnomer to call anything an abstract, because by definition, abstract is something that doesn't have a definition. So, let alone have a group discussion about something, I don't think we can have a collective definition that everybody can agree with. So, what happens when a topic becomes an abstract in nature? What happens is that it's just open to interpretation. And a lot of the times you will see, if you look at some videos online, you will see that what people are doing are just spending 10 to 12 minutes coming up with 1,500 different definitions of the same thing. Okay, and that's a really bad way of going about the topic. And I'm here to tell you that if that starts to happen in a discussion, please make note of it and come back to discussing a definition instead of piling on one definition after another till your time is up. But let's take a couple of examples and see what happens. So the first example I'll take is kind of a rogue abstract topic. And by that I mean that it's the kind of topic that makes you think that you know about it, so you can talk about it. It also makes you think that there are a bunch of different ways of thinking about the same thing. And then when you start thinking about it, apart from maybe one puny example, you have nothing to say about it. The topic that I want to think about right now is road rage makes life stressful. Okay, I'll repeat, road rage makes life stressful. Everybody agrees? Yes. I agree as well, even though I don't drive myself. Now, the term road rage is not contained by any nation. It's not contained by any kind of driving. It's rage that is associated with the pure act of being on the road. You could be a bicycle driver, you could be a motorcyclist, you could be a full-on driver with a vehicle, and road rage could still subject you to some kind of stress. Getting a topic like this one in a group discussion is a blessing in disguise, because one, there is virtually no end to how long this discussion can go. But it's also a bit of a curse in disguise, because everybody will have something to say about it, whether it's their own experience or it's their experience that they share with someone, and that's why everybody will just jump on it. They will jump on the opportunity of saying something that they have already experienced, which is why we call it a rogue abstract topic. A couple of things to keep in mind when such a topic arises is that, one, don't make all the focus of this discussion to be that all the definitions that you have, you should present all of them in that span of 10 minutes. That's not the point. Remember and keep reminding yourself and the others that it's a group discussion. So make sure that every point is discussed to a certain degree. Okay, if there is somebody who makes a bit of an interpretation or makes a definition, makes an attempt to try to explain it to the other people, instead of saying, yes, I agree and I also want to add that it can also mean, don't say that. Instead say, okay, that's good, let's talk about that. That's a good take. Road rage is also something that could be very personal and painful to the others, and they will try to bring in examples which are a little tragic, okay? And a good way of dealing with such moments is to let it pass, okay? You don't have to have a reaction right there and then. You don't even have to say, oh, I'm very sorry for your loss, or let's take a moment and express how badly we feel about it. You don't have to have a response or a reaction. Let it pass. The person may be out of nervousness, out of tension, out of stress, just brought up that example from somewhere and they said it. They maybe didn't even mean to make everything about that tragic incident. They may have just wanted to use it as an example. So let it be an example and quickly move on. But the point is that when you have such an example in which you feel like I'm very comfortable talking about it, and then you end up thinking that, yeah, apart from an example, I don't really have an opinion on it, at that time, explore the definition a lot more, okay? Interpret it a lot more instead of relying on your general knowledge. And that's where you can actually have a good discussion which ends up being a discourse, a talk, instead of just a bunch of definitions which have nothing to do with one another. The final thing that I want to talk about when speaking about topics and how to deal with them is to take on an example which is purely an expression in the English language, something that is used to kind of sum up a couple of instances or a couple of perceptions. And the topic that I want to discuss right now is perception can be deadly if not analyzed. That's perception can be deadly if not analyzed. This is a brilliant example of having a point of view examined from various ways, having the possibility of students saying yes, that's correct, or no, that's incorrect, having the possibility of saying, that's interesting, let's talk about this a little more, and also having the possibility of saying that right now this is applicable in so many ways, and let's find examples of saying that. Depending on the kind of group that you have, this discussion can go really well, and it can also crash and burn. Let's talk a little bit about the second one, because I think that's a big possibility. Now, when you say that perception can be deadly if not analyzed, it's a slightly fancier way of saying that a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. I'm sure some of you have heard of that already. Or an even more dated example, which is ignorance is bliss. The understated, the underpinning of all of these expressions is the same thing, that if you don't know a lot about something, then it's better to learn a lot about something before you form an opinion. Perception is just another way of saying that you have an opinion, you have a take on things, you have a certain point of view about it, and which is all right. But when students who are still rather young, still rather inexperienced in terms of the real world, and have not had a long experience in dealing with all sorts of people, it's easier for them to assume a certain amount of authority and say that yes, what we know is definitely correct and there are no other ways of thinking about it. And if you put a bunch of such people in a group, you can imagine the dimensions of that discussion. There will be very few of them. So the one thing that I want to highlight right now is, when such a topic arises, you will notice that a lot of repetition tends to happen. Because people are trying to figure out as they speak how they feel about it, they will tend to repeat the expression over and over again. And here's my advice to you: please avoid doing that. Instead, start working on a definition, start working on the meaning, what it represents to you right from the get-go, and start talking about the expression and not just around the expression. Okay, I'll give you an example. An example of, endless repetition would sound something like, so the topic we have is perception can be deadly if not analyzed, and I think what we're talking about is if we have a perception which is not analyzed well, it can be very deadly, and that simply means that people have different perceptions and they cannot always analyze them fully, and that's why they can be a little dangerous or deadly. Sound familiar? Yeah. Now, a bunch of talking like that, I could have gone on for 4 or 5 more, or 30 or 40 more seconds. A meaningless tautology, a cyclical argument like that tends to happen a lot more than you would think. And imagine 7 or 8 people saying that. That would get really boring. Okay, now instead, let's talk about how it would sound if somebody chose to explain that expression and then go on by building an argument about it. So the topic we have is perception can be deadly if not analyzed. I think what we can talk about is how people have different points of view depending on where they are in life and where they come from. And analysis is not a tool that is present or easily available to everybody. Some people are not even capable of analyzing themselves or reflecting on themselves, and that's why their points of view become a little clouded by other people's judgment. And at that time, we can find ourselves questioning whether the knowledge we have, the perceptions that we make about the world, are they our own or are they derived from other people? And that's when analysis becomes important, because as we go on in the world and we grow up, we meet more people, our perceptions are bound to change and develop and grow. And with that, we can also see that the analysis of those perceptions become a lot more knowledgeable, allowing, and inclusive. Now, doesn't that sound like something that you would want to say? So the only thing that I did was picked up the nouns, picked up the verbs, and explained them for everybody else and for myself. Now, the moment I'm thinking about growing up with my perceptions and my judgments and then changing them according to people as opposed to changing them for myself, I'm on a very good tangent where I can keep thinking about it, I can reflect on my background, I can reflect on when I was younger, and I can give examples, and that's what makes a good discussion. And there you have it. Abstract topics are nothing but just a perception, which is deadly if not analyzed.